In the luminous corridors of medieval Baghdad, where the Tigris River reflects the golden domes of countless libraries and the air hums with intellectual fervor, there lived a man whose crisis of faith would reshape the entire landscape of human understanding. Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali, known to history simply as Al-Ghazali, stood at the crossroads of reason and revelation, philosophy and mysticism, doubt and certainty. His journey from the heights of academic glory to the depths of existential despair, and finally to a synthesis that would influence a billion souls, represents one of the most remarkable intellectual adventures in human history. Born in 1058 in the Persian town of Tus, Al-Ghazali would become known as Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam. But this title barely scratches the surface of his extraordinary legacy. He wasn't just a theologian or a philosopher or a mystic. He was all of these and something more, a bridge between worlds that seemed forever separated, a translator of truths that appeared untranslatable. What makes Al-Ghazali's story so captivating isn't merely his intellectual prowess. Though by age 34, he'd already become the most celebrated professor in the Islamic world. It's not just his prolific output. Over 70 works spanning law, theology, philosophy, ethics, and spirituality. It's the raw honesty with which he approached the most terrifying questions any human being can face. Can we really know anything? Is there a God? If so, why does he seem so distant? What's the point of all our striving and suffering? And can a finite mind ever grasp infinite truth? These questions weren't abstract puzzles for Al-Ghazali. They became so real, so urgent, that they literally paralyzed him. At the peak of his career, with hundreds of students awaiting his lectures and rulers seeking his counsel, he found himself unable to speak, unable to teach, unable to continue the life he'd built. His tongue, which had wielded arguments like a master swordsman, froze in his mouth. His mind, which had navigated the most complex theological debates, turned inward to face an abyss of doubt that threatened to swallow him whole. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Instead of being destroyed by this crisis, Al-Ghazali transformed it into a method. He turned his breakdown into a breakthrough. He discovered that the very doubt that paralyzes most seekers could become, when properly understood and channeled, the royal road to absolute certainty. His journey from skepticism to spiritual knowledge would produce insights that remain shockingly relevant nearly 1,000 years later, speaking to our contemporary struggles with meaning, purpose, and truth in ways that feel almost prophetic. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, if you're finding value in this exploration, I genuinely appreciate a like or subscription. It makes a real difference in helping these stories reach others who might need them. I'm always fascinated to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your city and what time it is there right now. It's beautiful seeing our community span continents and time zones, all connected through these timeless ideas. All right, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, put on some soft background sound, whatever helps you settle in. We're about to explore why you might be asking the wrong questions about knowledge, why the search for certainty could be your greatest spiritual practice, and how an 11th century crisis of faith might hold the key to resolving your 21st century anxieties. Let's begin. Part 1. The Anatomy of Certainty. To understand Al-Ghazali's revolution in thought, we need to start where he started, not with grand theories or elaborate systems, but with a simple, devastating question. What does it actually mean to know something? Most of us go through life assuming we know all sorts of things. You know your name. You know where you live. You know that fire is hot and ice is cold. You know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But do you really know these things? What's happening in your mind when you claim to know something? And how can you distinguish genuine knowledge from mere belief, opinion, or illusion? Al-Ghazali realized that before we can know anything about the external world, God, morality, or any profound topic, we must first understand the very nature of knowledge itself. It's like trying to measure things without first understanding what a ruler is or how measurement works. You might get lucky and measure correctly, but you wouldn't really know why your measurements were accurate or when they might be leading you astray. In his masterwork, The Deliverance from Error, Al-Ghazali describes his methodical examination of different types of knowledge claims. He wasn't satisfied with vague notions or conventional wisdom. He demanded clarity, precision, and above all, certainty. And here's where it gets interesting. He discovered that most of what people call knowledge doesn't actually meet the criteria for genuine knowledge at all. Think about the things you're most confident about. Maybe you're certain the sun will rise tomorrow. Maybe you're confident in scientific facts you learned in school. Maybe you believe deeply in moral principles passed down from your parents or culture. Al-Ghazali would ask you, what's the basis of this certainty? Is it merely habit? Is it authority? Is it sense experience? Is it rational deduction? And for each basis you offer, he'd show you how it could be called into question. He distinguished between 4 fundamentally different sources that people rely on for knowledge. First, there's sensory perception. We trust our eyes, ears, and other senses to tell us about the world. Second, there's rational demonstration, the kind of logical and mathematical reasoning that seems to produce necessary truths. Third, there's testimony and authority, believing things because reliable people have told us they're true. And fourth, there's direct, intuitive experience, immediate awareness that doesn't depend on inference or sense data. Now here's where Al-Ghazali's analysis becomes revolutionary. He systematically showed that the first 3 sources, the ones most people rely on most heavily, are fundamentally unreliable when it comes to achieving ultimate certainty. And this wasn't just philosophical game playing. He meant it absolutely seriously. Consider sensory perception. We all know our senses can deceive us in small ways. You see a mirage in the desert. You mistake a rope for a snake in dim light. You experience optical illusions. But Al-Ghazali pushed much further. He argued that the very structure of sense perception makes it incapable of revealing things as they truly are in themselves. Your senses don't show you reality. They show you your nervous system's interpretation of certain stimuli. The color you see, the sound you hear, the pain you feel, these are experiences in your consciousness, not properties of external objects. You might think the sun is yellow, but the sun isn't really yellow. Yellowness is an experience that happens in your visual cortex when certain wavelengths of light strike your retina. The sun itself, whatever it is in reality, is neither yellow nor any other color. Colors are experiences, not properties of objects. The same goes for sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations. Everything you experience through your senses is a translation, a representation, not the thing itself. This led Al-Ghazali to a shocking conclusion. If all our sense experience is really just internal mental states, how do we know there's an external world at all? Maybe what we call the physical universe is nothing more than a particularly stable and coherent set of experiences, like a dream we can't wake up from. This wasn't just theoretical speculation for Al-Ghazali. During his crisis, he genuinely couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life might be a kind of dream, and that the real awakening was still to come. But if sensory knowledge is unreliable, what about rational knowledge? Surely mathematical and logical truths are certain. 2 plus 2 equals 4, regardless of what your senses tell you. The law of non-contradiction holds necessarily. A triangle's angles must sum to 180 degrees. These seem like bedrock certainties that nothing could overturn. Yet Al-Ghazali found grounds for doubt even here. He asked, "How do you know that the logical principles you use in reasoning actually correspond to the ultimate structure of reality? Maybe human logic is just a feature of how human brains work, not a mirror of cosmic truth. Perhaps there are modes of being that transcend our categories of thought, making our most rigorous deductions irrelevant to ultimate reality." Consider the law of non-contradiction. We say something cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. This seems obviously true. But is it? Or is it just that our minds are constructed in such a way that we cannot conceive of contradictions? Maybe reality itself contains genuine paradoxes that our logic cannot grasp. Maybe at the deepest level, existence and non-existence interpenetrate in ways that make our neat logical distinctions meaningless. Al-Ghazali pointed out that in dreams, we accept all sorts of logical impossibilities as real. You might dream you're simultaneously in your childhood home and a foreign country. You might dream you're both yourself and someone else. You might experience events in impossible sequences or encounter beings that violate every physical and logical law. And while you're dreaming, none of this seems problematic. The dream world has its own logic that feels completely coherent from within. So how do you know that waking consciousness isn't also operating with a limited logic that seems universal and necessary from within, but which might be transcended by a higher form of consciousness? Maybe after death, or through mystical experience, you'll wake into a state where the logic you now take for granted appears as limited and parochial as dream logic does from your current perspective. This isn't merely abstract philosophizing. Al-Ghazali was pointing to a genuine epistemic crisis. If you can't trust your senses and you can't ultimately trust your reason, what's left? How can you know anything at all? And this is where most skeptics throughout history have gotten stuck. They demonstrate the limitations of human knowledge and then either despair of finding truth or adopt a kind of pragmatic resignation, accepting that we must live with uncertainty. But Al-Ghazali didn't stop at skepticism. That was just the beginning. The destruction of false certainties, he realized, was necessary to make room for genuine knowledge. You have to clear away the debris before you can build on solid ground. And what he discovered through this process would change everything. He found that beneath all the layers of sensory data and rational inference, there's a kind of knowing that's self-authenticating, that carries its own guarantee of truth. He called this direct experiential knowledge, or taste, dawk in Arabic. This isn't knowledge about something external to you. It's knowledge that transforms you through the very act of knowing. It's the difference between reading about honey and tasting it, between studying anatomical diagrams of the heart and falling in love. This direct experiential knowledge can't be doubted in the way sensory or rational knowledge can be doubted. When you experience pain, you can't doubt that you're experiencing pain. You might doubt what's causing it. You might doubt whether it will continue. But you can't doubt the immediate fact of your pain experience itself. Similarly, when you experience joy, you can't doubt that you're experiencing joy, whatever you might doubt about its causes or duration. Al-Ghazali realized that this undoubtable, immediate experience could become a foundation for certainty if it were properly directed. Instead of being limited to trivial certainties, like I'm experiencing pain right now, or I seem to be seeing red, what if consciousness could be trained to directly experience profound truths about reality, God, and the self? What if there were disciplines and practices that could purify consciousness to the point where it becomes capable of apprehending ultimate reality directly, without the distorting mediation of senses or the limiting categories of discursive reason? This is where Al-Ghazali's journey led him from philosophy to Sufism, from theological debate to mystical practice. But before we explore that transformation, we need to understand his devastating critique of the philosophers of his day, because this critique would become one of the most influential works in the history of ideas. Part 2. The Incoherence of Pure Reason. By Al-Ghazali's time, Islamic civilization had absorbed and developed the entire corpus of Greek philosophy. Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, and other Greek thinkers had been translated into Arabic and extensively studied. A brilliant tradition of Islamic philosophy had emerged, exemplified by thinkers like Al-Farabi, and especially Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. These philosophers claimed that through pure reason alone, without relying on religious revelation, one could discover ultimate truths about God, the soul, the cosmos, and human destiny. They developed sophisticated metaphysical systems that seemed to explain everything from the creation of the universe to the fate of individual souls after death. And they were enormously influential, especially among educated elites who were attracted to the apparent certainty and elegance of philosophical demonstration. But Al-Ghazali saw danger in these philosophical systems, not because he was anti-intellectual or opposed to rational inquiry. Far from it. He'd mastered philosophy more thoroughly than most philosophers. No, the danger was more subtle and more serious. These philosophers were making claims that exceeded the legitimate bounds of human reason, and in doing so, they were leading people away from truths that could only be known through revelation and direct spiritual experience. So Al-Ghazali wrote one of the most devastating philosophical critiques ever penned, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In this work, he didn't simply reject philosophy wholesale. That would have been easy and unconvincing. Instead, he entered into the philosophers' own territory, accepted their methods and premises, and then showed that on their own terms, their systems collapse into contradiction and absurdity. He focused on 20 key positions that the philosophers held, and he demonstrated that 17 of these positions were rationally unproven and likely false. But 3 positions were so problematic that they rendered anyone who held them an unbeliever outside the bounds of Islam. These 3 positions concerned fundamental issues: the eternity of the world, God's knowledge of particulars, and the denial of bodily resurrection. Let's look at the first issue, the eternity of the world. The philosophers, following Aristotle, argued that the world has always existed and will always exist. There was no first moment of creation. time and the universe are eternal. They claimed this was provable through philosophical reasoning. After all, how could an eternal God suddenly decide to create at one moment rather than another? If God is eternal and unchanging, his creative act must also be eternal, which means the universe must be eternal too. Al-Ghazali showed that this argument, sophisticated as it sounds, is based on confused thinking. The philosophers were projecting human temporality onto God. They were assuming that God's creative act involves a before and after, a change from not creating to creating. But if God is truly eternal and transcendent, his creative act is also eternal, not in the sense that the universe always existed, but in the sense that God's creative will is eternal, and God's relationship to time is fundamentally different from our relationship to time. Think of it this way. When you will something to happen tomorrow, your willing happens today, before the event. Your willing is in time, just like the event you're willing. But God's willing isn't in time at all. God wills the entire temporal sequence as a single eternal act. From God's perspective, there's no before the universe or after the universe. The whole of time is present to God's eternal now. So there's no contradiction in saying that God eternally wills a universe that has a temporal beginning. The philosopher's mistake was treating God as if he were just another being within the universe, subject to the same temporal constraints as everything else. But if God is truly transcendent, truly the creator of time itself, then our temporal categories don't apply to him. Their philosophical argument for the eternity of the world, which seemed so compelling, actually rested on a category mistake. But Al-Ghazali's critique went much deeper than pointing out logical errors. He showed that the entire project of using pure reason to derive metaphysical truths was fundamentally flawed. Reason is great for analyzing what we can observe and experience. It's excellent for mathematics and logic within defined formal systems. But when it tries to reach beyond experience to make claims about ultimate reality, it overextends itself. It becomes speculative rather than demonstrative. Consider the philosophers' attempts to prove God's existence through causal arguments. They said every effect must have a cause, and since you can't have an infinite regress of causes, there must be a first cause, which is God. This sounds convincing until you ask, why can't there be an infinite regress? What makes that impossible? The philosophers would say it's logically impossible. But is it really? Or is it just inconceivable to our finite minds? Al-Ghazali pointed out that the philosophers couldn't actually prove their causal principles. They assumed them as self-evident. But what seems self-evident to human reason might not reflect ultimate reality. Maybe causation itself is just a habit of mind, a pattern we project onto our experiences, rather than a fundamental feature of the universe. This was a radical suggestion that anticipated David Hume's skepticism about causation by 600 years. The second major issue where Al-Ghazali found the philosophers guilty of unbelief concerned God's knowledge. The philosophers argued that God knows only universal principles, not individual particular things. God knows humanity, but not you specifically. God knows the laws governing stars, but not the position of any particular star at any particular moment. Why did they claim this? Because they thought that knowing particulars would imply change in God. As particulars come into being and pass away, God's knowledge would have to change, which contradicts God's eternality and perfection. But Al-Ghazali saw that this position makes God ignorant, effectively blind to the actual world he supposedly created. What kind of God doesn't know his own creatures? What kind of creator is indifferent to the specific realities he's brought into existence? This wasn't just philosophically problematic. It contradicted the entire religious understanding of a God who knows each soul intimately, who hears prayers, who responds to human action. It made prayer meaningless and moral responsibility absurd. If God doesn't know what you specifically do, how can he judge or reward you? The philosopher's error, Al-Ghazali showed, stemmed from projecting human limitations onto God. Yes, for a human being, knowing changing particulars implies change in the knower. But God's mode of knowing is completely different from ours. God knows the entire temporal sequence of particulars in an eternal, unchanging way. His knowledge doesn't change when events occur, because he eternally knows every event that will ever occur. The distinction between past, present, and future that governs human consciousness doesn't apply to divine consciousness. The third issue, the denial of bodily resurrection, was perhaps most serious of all. The philosophers argued that only the soul survives death, not the body. They claimed that bodily resurrection is impossible because once matter decomposes and its atoms scatter, those specific atoms might become part of other organisms. The same carbon atom might be in your body, then in a plant, then in another person's body. So which body should that atom belong to at the resurrection? They also argued that bodily pleasures and pains are beneath the dignity of eternal life. The afterlife, they claimed, consists of pure intellectual contemplation, not physical experiences. This was influenced by Platonic contempt for matter and the body, treating physical existence as inherently inferior to intellectual existence. Al-Ghazali demolished these arguments. First, he pointed out that God, who created bodies in the first place, can certainly recreate them. The question of scattered atoms is irrelevant. God isn't limited to reassembling the same physical particles. He can create new bodies that are continuous with and appropriate to the persons who inhabit them. The real issue isn't the mechanics of resurrection, but whether bodily existence has genuine value and whether God has promised resurrection. Second, Al-Ghazali argued that human existence is fundamentally embodied. We're not souls trapped in bodies, waiting to be liberated into pure intellectuality. We're ensouled bodies, or embodied souls, unified beings whose identity includes physical dimensions. The afterlife that religion promises isn't an escape from embodiment, but the perfection of embodiment. Bodies transformed and glorified, freed from corruption and pain, but retaining their capacity for joy, delight, and communion. This might seem like narrow theological disputation, but Al-Ghazali was fighting for something crucial. He was defending the meaningfulness of human life in its fullness against a philosophical reductionism that tried to abstract away our concrete embodied existence in favor of pure intellectual abstraction. He was insisting that our physical joys and sorrows, our embodied experiences of love and beauty, aren't merely illusory appearances to be overcome, but are real and significant dimensions of existence that will be fulfilled, not annihilated, in the life to come. Through his critique of philosophy, Al-Ghazali wasn't rejecting rational thought. He was setting proper boundaries for it. Reason is an excellent servant, but a terrible master. When reason stays within its proper domain, analyzing evidence, clarifying concepts, drawing valid inferences, it's indispensable. But when reason presumes to replace revelation, to derive metaphysical truth from armchair speculation, to explain away mystery and reduce reality to what finite minds can fully comprehend, it becomes destructive. The philosopher's fundamental error, Al-Ghazali showed, was hubris, intellectual pride that couldn't accept the limits of human reason. They wanted total knowledge achieved through their own powers, without dependence on anything beyond themselves. But this is precisely the opposite of the wisdom that recognizes its own limitations, that remains open to truth from sources beyond rational demonstration, that can say, "I don't know," with humility, rather than constructing elaborate theories to paper over ignorance. Al-Ghazali's critique of philosophy sent shockwaves through the intellectual world of his time and continues to influence debates about the relationship between reason and faith to this day. But having cleared away false certainties, both in sensory empiricism and in rationalist philosophy, he still faced the central question: where then can genuine certainty be found? Part 3. The Sufi Solution. The breakthrough came during the darkest period of Al-Ghazali's life, after his paralysis of speech and thought made it impossible to continue teaching. After he'd rejected the knowledge claims of theologians and philosophers alike, he stood at an impasse. He'd destroyed all the false paths to certainty. But where was the true path? It was at this moment of absolute vulnerability, when all his intellectual pride had been stripped away, that Al-Ghazali turned to the Sufis, the Islamic mystics who claimed direct experiential knowledge of God. Initially, he'd been skeptical of them. Their claims seemed so subjective, so impossible to verify. They spoke of spiritual intoxication, of dying to self, of union with the divine. How could such experiences provide reliable knowledge? But now, having exhausted every other option, Al-Ghazali began to study Sufi texts seriously, and what he discovered transformed him. The Sufis weren't making arbitrary mystical claims. They had a rigorous methodology, a science of spiritual development as precise in its way as mathematics or logic. They described specific practices, meditation, remembrance of God, moral purification that produced predictable results. And crucially, they distinguished sharply between intellectual knowledge about spiritual realities and experiential knowledge of those realities. Here's the analogy Al-Ghazali used. Knowing about health and knowing what health feels like are completely different. A medical student might memorize every fact about physiology and disease, but if he's actually sick, all that knowledge won't help unless it's translated into practical treatment that restores health. Similarly, you can study theology and philosophy for decades, accumulating vast information about God, but remain utterly ignorant of God in any meaningful sense, because you've never actually experienced divine presence. The Sufis claimed that through systematic practice, consciousness could be transformed. The self that normally experiences reality through the distorting filters of ego, desire, and illusion could be purified to the point where it becomes a clear mirror, reflecting divine reality directly. This wasn't about gaining new information, but about removing obstacles to perception that's always available, but usually blocked. Think of it like this. The sun is always shining. But if you're in a room with closed shutters, you don't experience the sunlight. Opening the shutters doesn't create the sun or bring it into existence. It simply removes the barrier between you and what's already there. Similarly, God's reality, according to the Sufis, is more immediate and certain than anything else, but our consciousness is shuttered by ego, desire, distraction, and spiritual impurity. Spiritual practice is the systematic opening of these shutters. Al-Ghazali realized that this made perfect sense of his earlier epistemological investigations. He discovered that sensory and rational knowledge couldn't provide ultimate certainty because they're indirect, mediated by sense organs or conceptual categories that might not correspond to reality. But direct experiential knowledge, properly cultivated, couldn't be doubted. It wasn't knowledge about reality from a distance. It was immediate acquaintance with reality itself. So at age 38, Al-Ghazali did something almost unthinkable. He abandoned his prestigious position, his wealth, his fame, everything he'd worked his entire life to achieve. He left Baghdad and began a decade-long journey of spiritual practice and wandering. He went to Damascus and Jerusalem. He made the pilgrimage to Mecca. He spent time in isolated retreat, engaging in the rigorous spiritual disciplines of the Sufis. This wasn't a retreat from intellectual life into anti-intellectual mysticism. Al-Ghazali brought his formidable analytical mind to bear on spiritual practice itself. He studied the methodology, the psychology, the philosophy of mysticism with the same rigor he'd applied to law and theology. He tested claims, examined experiences, distinguished genuine spiritual states from delusional ones. He became, in effect, a scientist of consciousness, exploring inner territory with as much precision as an astronomer mapping the stars. What he discovered during this period would form the basis of his masterwork, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, a massive 40-book encyclopedia of spiritual and ethical knowledge. But more than any specific doctrines, what Al-Ghazali gained was certainty, genuine knowledge beyond all doubt. He describes mystical experience not as vague emotional states, but as direct perception of realities more certain than anything available through senses or reason. The classic analogy is someone born blind who suddenly gains sight. Before, they understood light and color only through descriptions, through analogies and comparisons to things they could experience. But once they see, they have direct knowledge that doesn't depend on inference or testimony. They simply know what blue is because they experience it directly. Similarly, Al-Ghazali claimed to have moved from merely hearing about divine reality to seeing it, experiencing it with a directness that left no room for doubt. This raises an obvious question. If mystical experience provides such certain knowledge, why doesn't everyone pursue it? Why do people remain content with second-hand religious knowledge or philosophical speculation? Al-Ghazali's answer is both simple and devastating. Because genuine spiritual transformation requires something most people are unwilling to give, the death of the ego. The obstacle to spiritual knowledge isn't intellectual. It's not that mystical realities are too complicated to understand or require special talents only some people have. The obstacle is the self, the ego structure that insists on being the center of reality. That wants to possess knowledge like it possesses other things, that refuses to surrender control. And most people, even most religious people, even most scholars of religion, aren't willing to undergo the kind of radical self-transformation that genuine spiritual knowledge requires. Think about what Al-Ghazali gave up: security, reputation, wealth, the satisfaction of being recognized and admired. Most people pursue exactly these things as the substance of a successful life. But Al-Ghazali walked away from all of it because he realized these external goods were obstacles to what he really sought: truth beyond all doubt, direct knowledge of ultimate reality. And here's where it gets really interesting. Al-Ghazali discovered that the spiritual practices that led to mystical knowledge weren't arbitrary. They had a psychological logic that he could articulate philosophically. Practices like meditation, remembrance of God, moral purification, and service to others weren't magic rituals. They were sophisticated technologies for transforming consciousness. Consider meditation on divine names and attributes. The Sufis would repeatedly invoke God's names: the merciful, the compassionate, the all-knowing, the loving, not as mere verbal repetition, but as focused contemplation. What's happening psychologically? You're directing consciousness again and again toward the ultimate source of existence, away from the endless distractions of worldly concerns. You're training attention, the way an athlete trains muscles. And just as physical training can expand your physical capacities beyond what seems possible, spiritual training can expand consciousness beyond its ordinary limits. Or consider moral purification. The Sufis insisted that you couldn't progress spiritually while maintaining vices like pride, envy, greed, or anger. Why? Because these vices are essentially contractions of consciousness, narrowing it around the ego's immediate desires and fears. Pride makes you obsessed with how others perceive you. Envy makes you resent others' good fortune. Greed makes you grasp and hoard. Anger makes you react impulsively. All these vices trap consciousness in self-centered patterns that prevent it from opening to wider reality. By systematically eliminating these vices and cultivating opposing virtues, humility, generosity, patience, love, you're not just becoming a better person in some abstract moral sense. You're removing the psychological obstacles that prevent direct spiritual perception. You're clearing the shutters that block divine light. Al-Ghazali integrated this mystical knowledge with his earlier philosophical and theological learning in ways that had never been done before. He showed how rational theology could serve as preparation for mystical knowledge, clarifying concepts and removing intellectual obstacles. He showed how Islamic law, properly understood, wasn't just external rules, but a comprehensive program for spiritual development. And he showed how mystical experience, far from contradicting rational knowledge or revelation, actually confirmed and completed them. But he was also careful to warn against the dangers of mysticism. Not all spiritual experiences are authentic. Not everyone who claims mystical knowledge actually has it. There are false mysticisms, delusions that feel profound, but actually lead away from truth. There are spiritual ego trips, where people think they've transcended ego, but have merely dressed it up in spiritual language. And there are genuine mystical experiences that are misinterpreted because the person experiencing them lacks proper theological and philosophical formation. This is why Al-Ghazali insisted that authentic mysticism requires three foundations. First, intellectual clarity through study of theology and philosophy. Second, moral purification through practicing Islamic law and ethics. Third, spiritual practice under the guidance of a qualified teacher who's traveled the path before and can help you avoid common pitfalls. Without these foundations, mysticism becomes dangerous, either descending into delusion or leading to antinomian claims that spiritual insight places one beyond moral law. Part 4. The Architecture of Reality. Having found certainty through direct spiritual experience, Al-Ghazali was ready to articulate a comprehensive vision of reality that integrated revelation, reason, and mystical insight. And what he produced was breathtaking in its depth and sophistication. At the center of Al-Ghazali's metaphysics is a radical thesis. Existence belongs to God alone in the fullest sense. Everything else exists only derivatively, dependently, precariously. This isn't pantheism, the claim that everything is God. It's something subtler and more profound. It's the recognition that created things have no existence in themselves, no independent standing in reality. They exist only insofar as they're continuously upheld by divine creative power. Think of how an image exists in a mirror. The image seems to have color, shape, solidity, but it has no reality apart from the object being reflected and the reflective surface of the mirror. Remove either one, and the image vanishes instantly. The image is real in a sense. You can see it, photograph it, even mistake it for the real thing. But it has no independent existence. Similarly, Al-Ghazali argued, created things are real, but have no independent existence. They exist only as effects of divine creative activity, as manifestations of divine attributes. You exist, but not in the way God exists. Your existence is contingent, borrowed, sustained moment by moment. God's existence is necessary, self-subsistent, the very ground of being itself. This has profound implications for how we understand causation. Ordinarily, we think of causes as independent things that produce effects through their own inherent powers. Fire causes heat. The sun causes plants to grow. Your decision causes your action. But Al-Ghazali challenged this entire picture through an argument that would become famous and controversial. He argued that what we call causation is really just constant conjunction observed through habit. We see that fire is always followed by heat, so we assume fire causes heat. But we never actually observe causation itself, only the regular sequence of events. Moreover, even if we grant that one event precedes another regularly, this doesn't prove that the first event has the power to produce the second. Maybe there's a hidden cause, God's continuous creative activity, that produces both events in sequence but is never directly observed. Consider combustion. Common sense says the fire causes the wood to burn. But on deeper analysis, what's really happening? Molecules are breaking apart and recombining. Energy is being released. Electromagnetic forces are at work. The fire itself isn't a thing, but a process, a pattern of chemical reactions. And those chemical reactions depend on atomic structure, which depends on quantum mechanical laws, which depend on what? At every level of analysis, what seems like independent causal power dissolves into more fundamental laws and structures. And those laws and structures don't explain themselves. They're regularities that need to be sustained by something. Al-Ghazali's point wasn't to deny that fire regularly precedes burning, or that we can make reliable predictions about such sequences. His point was that the ultimate source of these regularities is divine will, not intrinsic powers of created things. God is the real agent behind every apparent cause, the true power that makes everything happen. This doctrine, sometimes called occasionalism, had dramatic implications. It means that when you raise your arm, God is the one directly causing your arm to rise. Your will is the occasion for God's action, not the cause. When fire touches cotton, God directly creates the burning of the cotton. The fire is merely the occasion for God's creative act. Nothing in creation has genuine causal efficacy. Everything is directly dependent on God's continuous creative activity from moment to moment. Western philosophers who encountered this view centuries later, like Malebranche and Berkeley, were deeply influenced by it. And in our own time, some physicists and philosophers have suggested that Al-Ghazali's skepticism about causation was remarkably prescient. Quantum mechanics, after all, has revealed that at fundamental levels, nature doesn't seem to operate through deterministic causation at all, but through probabilistic patterns that might indeed be better understood as regularities sustained by something beyond the physical, rather than intrinsic causal powers of particles. But Al-Ghazali's most profound insight concerned not the metaphysics of causation, but the nature of divine attributes. How do we understand God's relationship to the world? Traditional theology tended toward one of two extremes. Either it made God so transcendent, so utterly different from creation, that any positive statements about God became meaningless. How can we say God is knowing or powerful if God's knowledge and power are completely unlike ours? But the other extreme was equally problematic, treating God as if he were just a very powerful being with human-like qualities, only magnified. Al-Ghazali navigated between these extremes with extraordinary subtlety. He insisted that when we attribute knowledge, power, will, and other qualities to God, we're using words analogically, not univocally or equivocally. God's knowledge is genuinely knowledge, not something completely different that we're arbitrarily calling knowledge. But it's also not knowledge in exactly the same sense that human knowledge is knowledge. There's similarity and difference, connection and transcendence. To understand this, consider the difference between a child's understanding of love and a mature adult's understanding of love. They're using the same word, and there's real continuity. The adult's love grows from and includes something of the child's love. But the adult's love is also immeasurably deeper, more nuanced, more expansive than the child can comprehend. The child knows love truly but inadequately. Similarly, we know God's attributes truly through our concepts of knowledge, power, and love, but infinitely inadequately, because God's knowledge, power, and love infinitely transcend anything we can experience or imagine. This approach allowed Al-Ghazali to preserve both the reality of religious language and the transcendence of God. We're not just speaking nonsense when we say God is merciful, but we're also not fully grasping what divine mercy is. We're pointing toward a reality that includes and infinitely exceeds what we mean by mercy. He applied this same analogical thinking to the problem of divine action in time. How can an eternal God act at specific moments? How can the unchanging God respond to prayers? The philosopher's solution was to deny that God acts in time at all or responds to anything. But this made God irrelevant to human life. The crude, literalist solution was to treat God as if he exists in time, changing and responding like a human being would. But this compromised divine transcendence and perfection. Al-Ghazali's solution was more sophisticated. God's action isn't temporal in the way human action is, occurring at moments and changing from before to after. Rather, God eternally wills the entire temporal sequence, including all the responses and interactions with creatures. From our perspective within time, it seems like God responds to our prayers or acts at specific moments. From God's eternal perspective, The entire temporal sequence, including all divine actions and human responses, is eternally present as a single, unified creative act. Think of how a novelist relates to their story. The characters in the story experience events as happening in temporal sequence, one thing after another. Characters act, experience consequences, grow, and change. But the author knows the entire story simultaneously. The author can say that a later event in the story influences an earlier one through foreshadowing, or that a character's prayer in Chapter 5 is answered in Chapter 10, all while holding the entire narrative in mind as a simultaneous whole. Similarly, God's eternal consciousness encompasses the entire temporal sequence of creation simultaneously, even though from our perspective within that sequence, events unfold one after another. This allowed Al-Ghazali to affirm both divine transcendence and divine involvement, both God's eternity and God's responsiveness. It's a profound synthesis that continues to influence theological thinking today, offering resources for addressing contemporary questions about God's relationship to time and temporality. Part 5. The Science of the Heart. But Al-Ghazali's greatest contribution might be his sophisticated analysis of the human person and the psychology of spiritual development. In his revival of the religious sciences, particularly in the books on the purification of the heart, he developed what we might call a map of consciousness that's remarkable in its psychological insight. He distinguished between 4 facets of human nature that must all be addressed for genuine flourishing. First, there's the physical body with its biological needs and desires. Second, there's the animal soul, the psyche we share with other animals that experiences emotions, seeks pleasure, and avoids pain. Third, there's the rational soul, uniquely human capacity for abstract thought, moral judgment, and understanding. Fourth, and most important, there's the spirit, or heart, the deepest dimension of human consciousness that's capable of knowing God directly. The tragedy of most people's lives, according to Al-Ghazali, is that they remain fixated on the first 2 levels, the body and the animal soul. They spend their entire existence pursuing physical pleasures, emotional satisfactions, social status, and security. There's nothing wrong with these goods as such. The body needs food. Emotions need expression. Social connection matters. But when these become ultimate concerns, when life is organized entirely around satisfying bodily desires and emotional wants, the higher dimensions of human nature atrophy and die. Think of someone who's become extraordinarily successful in worldly terms. They've accumulated wealth, achieved status, experienced countless pleasures, but they feel empty, restless, vaguely dissatisfied despite having everything they thought they wanted. What's happening? Their spirit, their deepest self, remains unnourished. They've fed the body and the animal soul, but starved the higher faculties that make genuine happiness possible. Al-Ghazali compared the human person to a kingdom with different citizens making competing demands. The body is like common laborers who need food, rest, shelter. The animal soul is like merchants who want profit, pleasure, success. The rational soul is like ministers who want order, justice, wise governance. And the spirit is like the king who needs connection with the higher authority from whom his kingdom derives legitimacy. In most people, the kingdom is in chaos. The laborers and merchants have seized control, demanding that all resources be devoted to their satisfaction. The ministers are ignored or co-opted, using their intelligence merely to devise better ways to satisfy lower desires. And the king is imprisoned or asleep, his true needs forgotten. The result is a kingdom that might seem prosperous on the surface, but is fundamentally disordered, incapable of achieving the peace and fulfillment it was designed for. Spiritual development, on this analogy, means restoring proper order to the kingdom. It's not about suppressing or destroying the lower faculties. The body's needs are real and must be met. Emotions are valuable and need expression. But they must be properly subordinated to higher purposes. The laborers should be given what they need to work effectively, not what they want in every passing whim. The merchants should conduct their business in service of the kingdom's welfare, not in pursuit of profit, regardless of consequences. The ministers should govern with wisdom, using reason to discern and implement authentic goods. And the king must be restored to his throne, ensuring that the entire kingdom is oriented toward its true purpose, connection with divine reality. Al-Ghazali provided incredibly detailed analysis of how this reordering happens. He examined specific virtues and vices, showing how each vice is essentially a disorder in the soul, where a lower faculty has usurped control, and how each corresponding virtue represents proper order being restored. Pride, for instance, is what happens when the ego appropriates to itself qualities that really belong to God, or that are gifts rather than accomplishments. Humility isn't self-hatred or denial of genuine gifts, but proper perspective, recognizing that all good qualities are divine gifts, and that one's true identity isn't found in these passing attributes, but in one's essential relationship to God. Or, consider anger. Al-Ghazali didn't say, all anger is bad. Righteous anger against injustice is appropriate and even necessary. But anger becomes a vice when it's disproportionate, reactive, self-centered, springing from ego protection rather than genuine moral concern. The virtue isn't the elimination of anger, but its proper training and channeling, so that one becomes angry at what truly deserves anger, in appropriate measure, at the right time, for the right reasons. He applied the same sophisticated analysis to dozens of virtues and vices: generosity and greed, patience and rashness, courage and cowardice, love and lust. In each case, he showed that virtue isn't a mean between extremes, as Aristotle thought, but proper ordering, the right faculty ruling at the right time for the right purpose under the governance of the spirit oriented toward God. What's remarkable is how psychological Al-Ghazali's analysis remains, even after 9 centuries. He understood that vices aren't just wrong actions, but patterns of consciousness that distort perception and judgment. When you're in the grip of pride, you literally can't see reality accurately. You overestimate your own qualities and underestimate others. You interpret neutral events as attacks on your status. You become defensive and reactive. The prideful person isn't just behaving badly. They're living in a different reality, one structured by ego illusion. Similarly with other vices. The greedy person sees everything in terms of possession and loss. The lustful person reduces others to objects of desire. The envious person is tortured by others' good fortune. Each vice creates its own distorted world, its own way of misperceiving reality. And these distortions reinforce themselves, creating vicious cycles that become harder to escape the longer they persist. Conversely, each virtue opens consciousness to perceive reality more accurately. The humble person can see others' genuine worth without feeling threatened. The generous person experiences the joy of giving and recognizes abundance where the greedy person sees only scarcity. The loving person encounters others as genuine subjects, fellow travelers on the spiritual journey, rather than as obstacles or objects. Virtue isn't just being good, it's seeing truly. This is why moral purification is essential for spiritual knowledge. It's not that God rewards virtue with mystical experience as an external prize. It's that virtue literally enables the perception of realities that vices obscure. A proud person can't experience divine love because pride closes the heart. An envious person can't experience gratitude for existence because envy makes them resent reality. A lustful person can't experience genuine communion because lust reduces others to means of self-gratification. The vices are like cataracts that cloud spiritual vision. Removing them doesn't create new realities to perceive. It removes the obstacles to perceiving what's always been there. Al-Ghazali also provided practical guidance for this transformation. He didn't just describe ideal states. He laid out concrete practices for moving from vice to virtue, from dispersion to concentration, from ego consciousness to God consciousness. These practices included meditation, remembrance of death, examination of conscience, moral accounting, where you review your actions each day, voluntary simplicity, fasting and vigils, generous giving, and above all, constant remembrance of God. But he warned against mechanical practice of these disciplines. The point isn't to accumulate spiritual merit through external actions. The point is transformation of consciousness. You could perform every religious practice perfectly and remain completely unchanged if you're doing them with the wrong intention or in the wrong spirit. The practices are means, not ends. They're training methods for consciousness, tools for removing obstacles, not magical rituals that automatically produce results. Part 6. The Problem of Evil and Divine Justice. One of the most challenging questions in any religious philosophy concerns the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and perfectly good, why does evil exist? Why do innocent people suffer? Why are the wicked often prosperous while the righteous struggle? Al-Ghazali confronted these questions directly, and his responses reveal both the depth of his thought and his refusal to offer easy answers to hard problems. First, he distinguished between different types of evil. There's physical evil, pain, suffering, disease, natural disasters. There's moral evil, the wickedness that human beings choose. And there's metaphysical evil, imperfection, limitation, finitude. These are distinct problems, requiring distinct responses. Regarding metaphysical evil, Al-Ghazali argued that it's not really evil at all, but a necessary consequence of creation. For anything to be created means for it to be limited, finite, imperfect. Only God is infinite and perfect. Everything else, by virtue of being a creature rather than the creator, must be limited in various ways. To complain about metaphysical evil is like complaining that the number 2 isn't the number 3. It's a category mistake. Created things are limited because that's what it means to be created. But this doesn't address physical and moral evil, which seem genuinely bad, not just limitations, but actual harms. Al-Ghazali's response to physical evil focused on the limitations of human perspective. What seems evil from our limited viewpoint might serve larger purposes we can't perceive. A painful medical treatment seems evil to a child who doesn't understand it's necessary for healing. A difficult period in life might develop character and wisdom that wouldn't emerge through ease and comfort. The very challenges that seem to make life unbearable might be what makes profound growth possible. This doesn't mean that all suffering is pedagogical or that we should be passive in the face of evil. Al-Ghazali strongly emphasized human responsibility to fight injustice, alleviate suffering, and promote welfare. But it does mean that we shouldn't judge God's purposes by our limited understanding. We see fragments. God sees the whole. We experience moments. God sees eternity. What seems senseless from within time might reveal profound meaning from the perspective of eternity. Regarding moral evil, Al-Ghazali emphasized human freedom and responsibility. God doesn't cause human wickedness. Humans choose to do evil, and that choice is genuinely theirs. But this raises another question. If God knows everything, including what choices we'll make, how are we really free? If God knows infallibly that you'll choose evil tomorrow, can you actually choose otherwise? Al-Ghazali's response navigated between fatalism and libertarianism. He affirmed that God's knowledge doesn't cause our choices. God's knowing what you'll choose doesn't make you choose it. The causation runs the other way. You choose, and God knows your choice. That God knows it from eternity doesn't make it less your choice. It's the same way that my knowing yesterday that you would read this today doesn't mean I caused you to read it. Knowledge of an action isn't the cause of that action. But Al-Ghazali also acknowledged mystery here. How exactly divine sovereignty and human freedom fit together is ultimately beyond human comprehension. We must affirm both. God is sovereign over all, and humans are genuinely responsible for their choices, even if we can't fully understand how both can be true. This isn't intellectual cowardice, but proper humility before mystery. He illustrated this with the analogy of a master calligrapher who guides a student's hand. The student is really writing. The letters are formed by the student's movement. But the master's guidance is also real, directing and enabling the student's action. The letter is produced by both simultaneously, in ways that can't be reduced to simple cause and effect. Similarly, human action is both genuinely ours and enabled by divine power in ways that transcend our categories of causation. The most profound dimension of Al-Ghazali's treatment of evil, though, concerned not explanation, but response. He argued that the proper response to evil isn't primarily intellectual, demanding explanations that satisfy our sense of justice. The proper response is trust in divine wisdom, even when we don't understand, patience in suffering, action to alleviate evil where possible, and above all, recognition that this world is not ultimate. This life, with all its evils and imperfections, is temporary. It's a testing ground, a place of spiritual development, not the final word on human existence. The injustices of this world will be resolved in the life to come. The wicked who prosper here will face divine justice. The righteous who suffer will be compensated infinitely. The apparent triumph of evil is temporary and illusory. Ultimate reality is governed by perfect justice and infinite mercy. This might sound like pie-in-the-sky escapism, but Al-Ghazali understood it differently. Belief in the afterlife isn't escapism, but proper perspective. It's seeing this world in light of eternity, recognizing that temporal goods and evils aren't ultimate. This perspective doesn't make us passive. It makes us fearless. If this life isn't all there is, we can confront evil without despair, endure suffering without losing hope, and sacrifice temporal goods for eternal ones without regret. Part 7. the path of return. The ultimate purpose of human existence, according to Al-Ghazali, is the journey of return to God, not a spatial journey, but a transformation of consciousness that moves from distance to nearness, from ignorance to knowledge, from multiplicity to unity. This journey has stages, each building on the previous, each requiring specific practices and facing specific challenges. The first stage is awakening, the recognition that your current life is not what you're made for. Most people never even reach this stage. They sleepwalk through life, pursuing goals that culture or biology or circumstance has programmed into them, never questioning whether these goals are worth pursuing. The awakening happens when something cracks this complacency. Maybe suffering that can't be avoided. Maybe the hollowness of achieved goals. Maybe encountering someone who lives differently. Or maybe just grace, a moment when you glimpse that there's more to reality than you've been perceiving. Al-Ghazali's own awakening came through his skeptical crisis. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd achieved, suddenly seemed meaningless because it wasn't grounded in certain truth. For others, the awakening might come differently, but the essential element is the same. You recognize that you've been asleep, and that waking up is both necessary and terrifyingly difficult. The second stage is seeking, actively searching for truth and meaning. This is where most people who awaken get stuck. They try this philosophy, that practice, this teacher, that tradition, sampling spiritual approaches like someone browsing a buffet, taking a little of everything, but never committing deeply to anything. Or they commit prematurely, latching onto the first thing that offers apparent certainty without properly testing it. Al-Ghazali insisted that genuine seeking requires three qualities. Sincerity, you must genuinely want truth more than comfort or confirmation of your existing beliefs. Thoroughness, you must investigate seriously, not superficially, actually studying and practicing, not just reading about or hearing about. And discernment, you must be able to distinguish authentic teaching from false, genuine spiritual experience, from delusion, true teachers from charlatans. This stage involves intellectual work, studying theology and philosophy to clarify concepts and remove intellectual obstacles. It involves moral work, examining your character and beginning to purify it. And it involves experimental work, testing spiritual practices to see what they actually produce rather than just believing claims about them. The third stage is commitment, choosing a path and following it with complete dedication. Al-Ghazali emphasized that all genuine paths lead to the same ultimate truth, but you can't travel them all simultaneously. You must choose one and follow it deeply, rather than remaining always at the surface of multiple traditions. For Al-Ghazali, the path was Islamic, specifically the integration of Orthodox Sunni theology with Sufi practice. But he recognized that others might authentically reach truth through other traditions. This stage is where the real transformation begins. Through disciplined practice under proper guidance, the obstacles to spiritual perception are gradually removed. It's slow, difficult work. You face your own resistance, your ego's desperate attempts to maintain control, your attachments and aversions, your pride and fear. You fail repeatedly, fall back into old patterns, doubt whether progress is happening. But if you persist with sincerity and proper guidance, transformation does occur. Al-Ghazali described the signs of authentic spiritual progress: decreased attachment to worldly goods, not asceticism, but genuine inner freedom where possessions don't possess you. Increased capacity for compassion and love, seeing others with mercy rather than judgment. Greater patience with difficulty and gratitude for blessings. Decreased reactivity, being less triggered by circumstances or others' actions. And most importantly, moments of direct awareness of divine presence. Tastes of spiritual reality that confirm you're on the right path. The fourth stage is realization, direct experiential knowledge of divine reality. This isn't a permanent state that once achieved is never lost. It comes in degrees and can be deepened indefinitely. But at this stage, knowledge of God becomes immediate and certain, beyond all doubt, because it's based on direct experience rather than inference or testimony. Al-Ghazali was careful to distinguish between different types of mystical experience. Some are genuine but preliminary, like feeling overwhelming love or experiencing inner light. These are valuable, but can become obstacles if you mistake them for ultimate realization. Others are more profound, involving the dissolution of subject-object duality, where the distinction between knower and known seems to disappear. But even here, Al-Ghazali warned against certain mistakes. Some mystics have ecstatic experiences and conclude that they've become God, or that they are identical with divine reality. This is false interpretation of genuine experience. What actually happens is that consciousness becomes so absorbed in divine reality that awareness of separate self temporarily disappears. But this doesn't mean the self has literally become God or ceased to exist. It means the self has become transparent to divine reality, like a clear window through which light shines without obscuring it. The fifth and final stage is return to the world, bringing the fruits of spiritual realization back into ordinary life. This is crucial. Some mystics reach realization and then withdraw completely from society, feeling that worldly engagement is beneath them or that they've transcended ordinary morality. Al-Ghazali forcefully rejected this view. The point of spiritual development isn't escape from the world, but transformation of how you engage with it. The realized sage doesn't abandon family, community, or social responsibility. Rather, they engage with these more effectively because they're no longer driven by ego, fear, or attachment. They can serve others without being depleted because they're drawing on divine resources, not just personal energy. They can face difficulties without being overwhelmed because their peace doesn't depend on external circumstances. They can work for justice and reform without self-righteousness because they recognize their own need for divine mercy. This final stage is where Al-Ghazali spent the last decades of his life. After his 10-year withdrawal for spiritual practice, he returned to teaching, writing, and social engagement. But he was transformed. His teaching now integrated spiritual insight with intellectual clarity. His writings combined philosophical rigor with experiential depth. His social engagement was motivated by love rather than ambition. He had become what he called the complete human being, one who has developed all dimensions of human nature in proper harmony and proportion. Conclusion: the living legacy. Nearly 1,000 years after his death, Al-Ghazali's influence continues to resonate across multiple traditions and cultures. His synthesis of reason and revelation, his critique of philosophical overreach, his integration of law and mysticism, his profound psychological insights, all these contributions remain relevant to contemporary seekers struggling with similar questions in very different circumstances. In an age of scientific materialism that claims reason alone can explain reality, Al-Ghazali's demonstration of reason's limits remains pertinent. He showed that reason is excellent within its proper domain, but overreaches when it claims to replace revelation or explain away mystery. Today's debates between science and religion often founder because both sides fail to recognize the proper boundaries of their methods. In an age of religious fundamentalism that rejects reason and modern knowledge, Al-Ghazali's insistence on rational inquiry as preparation for spiritual knowledge offers an alternative. He showed that genuine faith doesn't require abandoning intellectual rigor or denying empirical facts. The goal is integration, using all our faculties, sensory, rational, and spiritual, to approach truth from different angles. In an age of spiritual consumerism, where people sample practices and traditions without deep commitment, Al-Ghazali's emphasis on thorough study and dedicated practice offers correction. Genuine transformation requires sustained effort under proper guidance, not just collecting experiences or accumulating techniques. The path is long and demanding, but the destination makes the journey worthwhile. What makes Al-Ghazali's teaching ultimately hopeful is his conviction that genuine knowledge of ultimate reality is possible, not through intellectual brilliance or theological correctness alone, but through transformation of consciousness that anyone can undertake. The path is open. The methods are known. The destination is certain. What's required is simply the courage to begin and the persistence to continue despite obstacles and setbacks. His life demonstrates that the journey from doubt to certainty, from anxiety to peace, from self-centered existence to God-centered purpose is real and achievable. But it requires something rare: radical honesty about your current state, willingness to question everything you think you know, courage to abandon what no longer serves your deepest purpose, humility to accept guidance, and persistent dedication to transformation even when progress seems imperceptible. The treasure that Al-Ghazali discovered through his lifelong quest remains available. The direct knowledge of divine reality, the unshakable certainty beyond all doubt, the peace that transcends understanding. These aren't merely historical curiosities or achievements of an exceptional saint. They're possibilities inscribed in human nature itself, available to anyone willing to undertake the journey with sincerity and proper guidance. As we face our own contemporary crises, intellectual, moral, spiritual, existential, Al-Ghazali's example shines like a lighthouse through the fog. He shows us that doubt doesn't have to lead to despair, but can become the gateway to genuine certainty. That reason doesn't have to oppose faith, but can prepare the ground for spiritual insight. That mystical experience doesn't require abandoning moral responsibility, but enhances it. That ancient wisdom remains relevant to modern challenges because it addresses perennial dimensions of human nature that transcend particular historical circumstances. The questions that drove Al-Ghazali's search: how can I know what's true? What's the purpose of existence? How can I find lasting satisfaction? Is there a God who knows and cares? How should I live? These questions haven't changed, and neither have the fundamental structures of human consciousness or the ultimate realities to which spiritual practice can awaken us. What Al-Ghazali discovered through his dramatic journey from professor to mystic, from intellectual crisis to spiritual realization, remains as true and accessible today as it was in medieval Baghdad. Part 8. The Alchemy of the Soul. One of Al-Ghazali's most original contributions, often overlooked in favor of his more famous works, concerns what he called the alchemy of happiness, the systematic science of transforming the base metal of ordinary consciousness into the gold of spiritual realization. This wasn't metaphorical language for Al-Ghazali. He genuinely believed there was a technology of transformation as precise and reliable as any physical science, if only one understood its principles and applied them correctly. The foundation of this spiritual alchemy rests on understanding what Al-Ghazali called the stations of the self. Human consciousness, he argued, exists in different configurations or states, each with its own characteristic perception of reality, its own motivations, its own sense of identity. Most people remain trapped in the lower stations their entire lives, never realizing that higher configurations are possible. The first station is what Al-Ghazali called the commanding self, the nafs al-amara. This is the ego in its most primitive form, driven entirely by immediate desires and aversions. Give me pleasure, protect me from pain, feed my appetites, defend my image. The commanding self recognizes no authority beyond its own wants. It's not evil in some cosmic sense, but it's profoundly limited, incapable of recognizing genuine goods that require sacrifice of immediate gratification. Think of a drug addict in the grip of craving. The entire universe collapses to a single point, the need for the next fix. Everything else, relationships, health, dignity, future well-being, becomes irrelevant. That's the commanding self in pure form. But Al-Ghazali pointed out that most people, even those who've never touched drugs, live in milder versions of this same state. Their commanding self just has more socially acceptable addictions: status, wealth, comfort, approval, control. The commanding self creates a distinctive experience of reality. The world appears as a collection of objects to be possessed or avoided, sources of pleasure to be seized or threats to be eliminated. Other people are either allies in pursuing your goals or obstacles to be overcome. There's no genuine empathy, no real communion, because everyone and everything is reduced to their utility for the ego's projects. This isn't conscious cruelty. It's simply that from within the commanding self's limited perspective, nothing else is visible. The transition from the commanding self to the second station, what Al-Ghazali called the blaming self, or nafs al-lawama, represents the first real spiritual awakening. This happens when consciousness begins to recognize the commanding self's limitations and starts judging itself. You find yourself doing things you know you shouldn't, failing to do things you know you should, and you feel genuine remorse. This is progress, not because self-blame is pleasant, but because it indicates emerging awareness of standards beyond immediate desire. The blaming self is characterized by internal conflict. Part of you wants to pursue spiritual growth, to live according to higher principles. But another part remains attached to old patterns, old gratifications, old ways of being. You try to meditate, and your mind floods with distractions. You commit to generosity and then feel resentful when you give. You want to be humble, but can't stop comparing yourself to others. This divided state is painful, but it's necessary. It's the stage where real transformation begins. Al-Ghazali compared this to a patient who's become aware of their illness. Before awareness, there's no suffering because you don't know anything's wrong. After healing, there's no suffering because health has been restored. But in between, there's the acute discomfort of recognizing sickness while not yet having recovered. The blaming self is spiritually sick consciousness that's become aware of its condition. This awareness is the prerequisite for treatment. The practices that characterize work at this station involve disciplined effort to overcome the commanding self's dominance. You fast to break the tyranny of appetite. You give generously to overcome greed. You serve others to diminish self-centeredness. You maintain silence to control the ego's need to assert itself through endless speech. You seek solitude to reduce dependence on others' approval. All these practices are forms of resistance training for consciousness, strengthening capacities that the commanding self has allowed to atrophy. But Al-Ghazali warned against a common error at this station. Some people become so focused on self-improvement that they develop a kind of spiritual materialism, treating virtues as possessions to be accumulated, achievements to be proud of. This is subtle, but it's actually the commanding self in disguise, now pursuing spiritual goods with the same grasping mentality it previously directed toward material goods. The person becomes proud of their humility, attached to their detachment, egotistical about their selflessness. The form has changed, but the underlying structure remains the same. The transition to the third station, the inspired self, or nafs al-mulhama, happens when discipline and effort have become so internalized that they're no longer experienced as struggle. You don't fight against anger or greed or pride. You simply find these impulses arising less frequently and with less power. When they do arise, you notice them with a kind of detached awareness rather than being swept away or having to mobilize willpower to resist. The virtues you've been practicing become your natural way of being, not achievements you maintain through constant vigilance. At this station, genuine spiritual experiences begin to occur with some regularity. Moments of expanded awareness where the usual boundaries of self seem permeable or transparent. Experiences of profound peace that don't depend on external circumstances. Intuitive insights that arise without deliberate reasoning. A sense of being guided or supported by something beyond your conscious ego. These experiences confirm that transformation is real and provide motivation to continue despite inevitable setbacks and plateaus. The inspired self lives in a different world than the commanding or blaming selves. Reality appears as fundamentally meaningful, even when specific circumstances are difficult. Other people are recognized as centers of consciousness and value in themselves, not merely as means to your ends. Moral principles are seen not as arbitrary rules, but as descriptions of how reality actually works at a deep level. There's a quality of flow to existence, a sense that you're participating in larger purposes that transcend narrow self-interest. But Al-Ghazali cautioned that even this station, elevated as it is, isn't the ultimate destination. The inspired self still maintains a subtle sense of separation, of being an individual who has spiritual experiences, who performs good actions, who progresses on the path. This residual self-consciousness, however refined, remains an obstacle to complete realization. The fourth station, the tranquil self, or nafs al-mutma'inna, emerges when even this subtle self-consciousness dissolves. This is the station of what Al-Ghazali called baqa, subsistence in God. After fana, annihilation of the separate self. These terms sound mystical and vague, but Al-Ghazali was describing specific transformations in the structure of consciousness that produce distinctive and verifiable results. At the tranquil station, action continues, but without the sense of being an individual agent performing actions. There's doing without a doer, awareness without an aware subject standing apart from what's experienced. This sounds paradoxical because our ordinary language and concepts are built around subject-object duality. But Al-Ghazali insisted it's experientially real and verifiable through practice, even if impossible to adequately describe in conventional terms. The person at this station doesn't disappear or become unconscious. Rather, consciousness expands to the point where its center is everywhere and nowhere, identified with the divine creative activity manifesting through all forms, rather than contracted around the illusion of separate selfhood. Actions arise spontaneously in response to circumstances, perfectly appropriate, but without calculation or self-conscious deliberation. There's complete presence, but no self-consciousness, total engagement, but no attachment to outcomes. This might sound passive or mechanical, but Al-Ghazali insisted it's actually the highest form of agency, action that's completely free because it's not constrained by ego's limited perspectives and grasping desires. The tranquil self doesn't act from fear or craving, but from immediate perception of what's called for, what serves the larger patterns of divine purpose manifesting through circumstances. Such action is simultaneously completely spontaneous and completely aligned with ultimate reality. There are two final stations that Al-Ghazali mentioned, but described only briefly, suggesting they're rare and perhaps accessible only to prophets and the greatest saints. The pleased self, nafs al-radiyya, characterized by complete satisfaction with whatever happens, seeing every circumstance as perfect manifestation of divine wisdom. And the perfected self, nafs al-kamila, the fully realized human being who has actualized all potential capacities and serves as a complete channel for divine activity in the world. But Al-Ghazali's point in describing these stations wasn't to create spiritual hierarchies or encourage comparison. It was to show that transformation is real, systematic, and progressive. You don't have to remain trapped in the commanding self's limited perspective. Change is possible, but it requires understanding where you are, what practices are appropriate for your current station, and patient commitment to the process despite setbacks and difficulties. The alchemy analogy captures something crucial. Physical alchemy fails because you can't actually transform lead into gold through chemical processes. But spiritual alchemy works because consciousness is inherently capable of transformation. The base metal of ordinary awareness really can become the gold of enlightened consciousness through proper understanding and practice. The transformation isn't magical or arbitrary, but follows discoverable principles as reliable as any natural law. Part 9: Time, Eternity, and the Architecture of Destiny. Another dimension of Al-Ghazali's thought that deserves careful attention concerns his understanding of time, divine foreknowledge, and human freedom. What medieval theologians called the problem of divine predestination versus human choice. This isn't just abstract theological speculation. It touches on deeply practical questions about human agency, moral responsibility, and the possibility of genuine change. The standard philosophical puzzles were well known in Al-Ghazali's time. If God knows everything that will happen, including every choice you'll make, then how are you free? If your actions are foreknown from eternity, aren't they in some sense already determined? And if they're determined, how can you be responsible for them? Conversely, if you're genuinely free, Doesn't that mean God doesn't know what you'll choose until you choose it? But then God isn't omniscient. The two concepts, divine foreknowledge and human freedom, seem mutually exclusive. Philosophers had proposed various solutions. Some denied human freedom, making everything predetermined. Some limited divine knowledge, saying God knows possibilities, but not which ones will be actualized. Some drew elaborate logical distinctions between different types of necessity. But Al-Ghazali found all these solutions inadequate because they failed to recognize something fundamental about the nature of time itself. His key insight was that time is created. It's not an eternal container within which events occur. It's itself part of the created order. Before creation, there's no time, no before and after, no succession of moments. Time begins with creation and ends with creation's end. This isn't just playing with words. It has profound implications for understanding divine knowledge and action. God doesn't exist in time. God's existence is purely eternal, which doesn't mean infinitely extended time, but complete transcendence of temporal succession. From God's eternal perspective, all temporal moments are equally present. The past hasn't ceased to exist. The future hasn't yet come to exist. Both past and future, along with the present, are simultaneously present to divine consciousness in an eternal now that comprehends the entire temporal sequence. Think of it like reading a book. From your perspective outside the narrative, all events in the story exist simultaneously. You can see the beginning, middle, and end together. You know what happens in chapter 20 while reading chapter 5. The characters in the story experience events as temporal succession, but from your perspective, the whole story is a simultaneous whole. Similarly, God's eternal perspective comprehends the entire temporal sequence of creation simultaneously. But here's the crucial point. This doesn't make human choices any less real or free. When a character in a novel makes a choice, that choice is real within the story's logic. The fact that the author knows what the character will choose doesn't make the character's choice any less genuine within the narrative. Similarly, God's eternal knowledge of your choices doesn't cause or compel those choices. You really choose, and your choice is what God eternally knows. Al-Ghazali illustrated this with a practical example. Imagine you're sitting on a hill overlooking a road. You see a traveler approaching a fork where the road splits. You can see both paths clearly, but the traveler, down in the valley, can only see a short distance ahead. You know which path the traveler will take, not because you're compelling their choice, but because from your elevated position, you can see their decision happening. Your foreknowledge doesn't cause their choice. Their choice is what you foreknow. Now extend this analogy. God's perspective is infinitely more elevated than yours on the hill. God sees not just spatial distance, but temporal distance. God sees the entire timeline of your choices, not as future events that haven't happened yet, but as eternal realities that are all simultaneously present to divine consciousness. God knows what you will choose, not by predicting or causing, but by directly perceiving your choice in its eternal reality. This means human freedom is real. Your choices genuinely originate with you. They're not predetermined by prior causes or divine decree in a way that removes your agency. But it also means divine sovereignty is real. God's creative activity sustains every moment of existence, including every moment of human willing and choosing. God's knowledge of your choices is perfect and certain. These aren't contradictory. They're complementary descriptions of reality from different perspectives, temporal and eternal. But Al-Ghazali pushed even further into subtle territory with his doctrine of divine decree and destiny, qadar. He distinguished between God's creative decree, which brings all things into existence, and God's commanding decree, which reveals how humans should act. The creative decree is absolute and inevitable. Whatever God wills to create necessarily comes into existence. Nothing can prevent it. But the commanding decree is not absolute in this sense. God commands humans to do good and forbid evil, but humans can and do disobey these commands. The disobedience itself falls under the creative decree. God wills to create humans with free will, even though this means they'll sometimes choose wrongly, but it violates the commanding decree. This distinction preserves both divine sovereignty and human responsibility. God is sovereign over all. Nothing happens outside divine creative will. But humans are responsible for their moral choices because they genuinely choose, and their choices can align with or violate divine commands. The fact that God creates humans with the capacity to choose wrongly doesn't make God responsible for their wrong choices. The choice itself, though permitted by divine creative decree, remains the human's responsibility. Al-Ghazali also addressed the question of why God creates some people who he knows will choose evil and end in damnation. Doesn't this make God unjust? His response involves several interwoven threads. First, God's justice isn't subject to human moral standards, but is its own standard. What seems unjust from limited human perspective might reflect perfect justice from divine perspective. Second, every soul that exists is given genuine opportunity to choose good. If they choose evil, the responsibility is theirs, not God's. Third, the existence of evil and its consequences serves larger purposes in manifesting divine attributes, justice, mercy, forgiveness, that couldn't be manifest in a world without moral freedom and its consequences. But Al-Ghazali cautioned against trying to fully comprehend divine wisdom in these matters. Some things remain mysterious, not because they're irrational, but because they exceed human capacity for understanding. The proper response isn't to construct elaborate theodicies that explain away mystery, but to trust in divine wisdom while working to align one's own will with divine commands. You can't know why God permits specific evils, but you can know that your responsibility is to choose good, work for justice, alleviate suffering where possible, and trust that apparent injustices will be resolved in eternity. His teaching on predestination and free will had important practical implications. It meant you couldn't use divine decree as an excuse for moral laziness or passive fatalism. If something bad happens, you can't say, "It was God's will, and therefore I have no responsibility." Your choices matter. Your efforts make a difference. God's decree doesn't operate as an alternative to human action, but through human action. You pray and work, trusting that both your prayer and your work are channels for divine will, while remaining real expressions of your own agency. Conversely, you couldn't become prideful about your good choices or achievements. Everything good you do is enabled by divine grace. Your abilities, your circumstances, your very existence are gifts. This doesn't eliminate your responsibility or make your choices meaningless, but it situates them properly as responses to divine initiative rather than self-generated accomplishments. The proper attitude is one of gratitude and humility, recognizing that you're responsible but not self-sufficient, that you genuinely choose, but your choosing is itself enabled by grace. Part 10. The Renewal of Religious Knowledge. Perhaps Al-Ghazali's most ambitious project was nothing less than the comprehensive renewal of Islamic religious knowledge, integrating legal, theological, and mystical dimensions that had been drifting into separate and sometimes conflicting schools. His massive revival of the religious sciences attempted to show how every aspect of Islamic practice, from ritual ablutions to business ethics to marriage to government, could be understood as integrated components of spiritual development. The genius of this work lies in how Al-Ghazali demonstrates the spiritual dimension of seemingly mundane religious observances. Take ritual prayer, the 5 daily prayers that Muslims are required to perform. Many Muslims perform prayers mechanically, going through the motions without genuine presence or understanding. The rationalist philosophers dismissed prayer as superstition, claiming that an eternal, unchanging God couldn't be affected by human petitions. And many mystics considered formal prayer an obstacle, preferring continuous meditation to structured ritual. Al-Ghazali showed how all these views miss the profound wisdom embedded in ritual prayer. Prayer isn't primarily about informing God of your needs, as if God didn't already know them. It's about transforming your consciousness through regular intervals of God remembrance throughout the day. The physical movements, standing, bowing, prostrating, aren't arbitrary. They're embodied expressions of submission, gratitude, and worship that engage the body in spiritual practice rather than treating spirituality as purely mental or emotional. The specific times for prayer aren't random either. Dawn prayer awakens consciousness to divine presence at the start of the day. Midday prayer interrupts worldly activity to realign attention. Afternoon prayer maintains awareness through the day's second half. Sunset prayer marks the transition from activity to rest. Night prayer prepares consciousness for sleep and dreams. Together, these 5 prayers structure the entire day around rhythmic return to God consciousness, preventing complete absorption in worldly concerns. The prescribed words and movements, repeated identically by Muslims worldwide, create what Al-Ghazali called a community of remembrance, millions of people orienting themselves toward the same reality at the same times, using the same words and gestures. This shared practice creates bonds that transcend language, culture, and ethnicity, manifesting the fundamental unity of the believing community. But it also trains the ego to surrender its demand for constant novelty and self-expression, accepting divinely ordained forms rather than insisting on individual preferences. At a deeper level, Al-Ghazali explained how each element of prayer corresponds to stages of spiritual ascent. Standing represents the initial awakening to God's presence. Bowing represents humility and self-lowering before divine majesty. Prostration represents complete submission and the death of ego. Sitting represents peace and equilibrium after surrender. Rising to repeat the cycle represents the rhythmic alternation between contraction and expansion that characterizes spiritual growth. The entire prayer is a microcosm of the spiritual journey encoded in physical movement. He applied the same kind of profound analysis to every aspect of religious practice. Fasting during Ramadan isn't just abstaining from food and drink. It's training consciousness to distinguish between real needs and habitual desires, developing capacity to endure difficulty without losing inner peace, cultivating empathy for those who hunger involuntarily, and creating space for spiritual experience by temporarily removing the constant distraction of eating and drinking. Pilgrimage to Mecca isn't just a journey to a sacred site. It's a symbolic death and rebirth. You leave your familiar environment and social role. You don simple white garments that erase distinctions of wealth and status. You enact Abraham's journey, reliving the foundational narrative of submission to divine will. You circumambulate the Kaaba, symbolizing the soul's orbit around the divine center. You stand on the plain of Arafat with millions of other pilgrims, experiencing humanity's essential equality before God. You return transformed, having died to your old self and been reborn to spiritual life. Charitable giving isn't just helping the poor, it's training consciousness and generosity, overcoming the ego's hoarding and grasping, recognizing that wealth is a divine trust to be used for collective welfare rather than a possession to be accumulated. The specific requirement to give 2.5% annually establishes a regular practice rather than leaving charity to occasional impulse. While the amount is significant enough to require genuine sacrifice, but not so large as to be crushing. Business ethics, rules against fraud, exploitation, interest on loans, these aren't arbitrary restrictions on commerce. They're designed to structure economic life around justice and human dignity rather than mere profit maximization. The prohibition on interest prevents wealth from concentrating automatically in creditors' hands through compound returns. Rules against fraud protect the vulnerable from exploitation. Requirements for honesty in business dealings create trust that makes commerce possible without expensive surveillance and enforcement. Marriage isn't just a social contract or means of sexual satisfaction. It's a microcosm of the soul's relationship with God, a school for learning selfless love, a context for spiritual development through commitment and intimacy. The rights and responsibilities of spouses aren't arbitrary cultural norms, but reflect psychological and spiritual realities about human flourishing. Parenting isn't just biological reproduction, but participation in divine creativity, shaping souls as well as bodies, preparing new generations to take up the human vocation. Even dietary laws and rules about cleanliness have spiritual dimensions. Forbidden foods aren't inherently evil, but abstaining from them trains consciousness and discipline and reminds you that physical life must be governed by spiritual principles. Ritual purity before prayer isn't superstitious anxiety about symbolic contamination. It's mindful attention to embodiment, recognizing that spiritual practice engages the whole person, body, and soul together, not just the mind or heart in isolation from physical existence. What's revolutionary about Al-Ghazali's approach is how he reintegrated dimensions that had become separated. The lawyers knew the rules, but often not their deeper purposes or spiritual significance. The philosophers understood abstract principles, but dismissed concrete practices as superstition. The mystics had spiritual experience, but sometimes neglected or rejected formal religious observance. Al-Ghazali showed how all these dimensions belong together, how legal observance prepares for mystical experience, how philosophical clarity prevents mystical delusion, how authentic mysticism deepens appreciation for revealed law. This integration wasn't just intellectual synthesis, it was lived experience. Al-Ghazali could explain the legal rulings for prayer with scholarly precision, articulate the philosophical principles underlying those rulings, and describe the mystical states accessible through proper practice. He united in himself dimensions that others kept separate, demonstrating that comprehensiveness, rather than specialization, represents the highest human development. Part 11. The technology of spiritual direction. One often overlooked aspect of Al-Ghazali's contribution concerns his sophisticated understanding of spiritual pedagogy, how transformation is actually facilitated through relationship between teacher and student. He wasn't just interested in abstract principles. He wanted to understand the concrete dynamics of how one person helps another move from ignorance to knowledge, from vice to virtue, from ego consciousness to God consciousness. Al-Ghazali recognized that spiritual transformation isn't primarily intellectual. You can understand principles perfectly and remain completely unchanged. The obstacle isn't lack of information, but the ego's resistance to transformation. So spiritual teaching requires more than transmitting ideas. It requires addressing the specific obstacles each individual faces, meeting them where they are, and skillfully guiding them forward. He described several types of students requiring different approaches. The intellectually gifted, but spiritually undeveloped, need to be challenged through rigorous study and debate that satisfies their minds while gradually revealing reason's limitations. If you try to bypass their intellectual needs and push them directly toward mystical practice, they'll resist or become confused. But if you engage their intellects fully, they'll eventually recognize on their own that intellectual understanding isn't sufficient for genuine transformation. The emotionally intense but undisciplined need structured practice that channels their energy productively, rather than lectures that will only excite them further without providing real direction. Give them specific practices, meditation techniques, ethical disciplines, service projects that absorb their energy and gradually develop stability and focus. Trying to calm them down through intellectual arguments about the importance of peace will fail because the problem isn't lack of information, but excess of undisciplined energy. The naturally peaceful but passive need to be energized and challenged. They're comfortable with their current state and see no need for change. You must awaken their aspiration by showing them what they're missing, perhaps through inspiring examples of realized saints, or by creating circumstances that reveal the limitations of their comfortable complacency. Without some dis-ease with their current state, they'll never undertake the demanding work transformation requires. The sincere but confused need, patient clarification, and gradual education. They want truth, but lack frameworks for understanding their experience. They mix authentic intuition with cultural conditioning, genuine insight with wishful thinking, healthy aspiration with spiritual materialism. They need a skilled teacher who can help them distinguish these threads, affirming what's authentic while gently correcting errors and providing frameworks for further development. Al-Ghazali emphasized that effective spiritual direction requires the teacher to truly see the student, to understand their particular constellation of gifts and obstacles, strengths and weaknesses, not imposing a one-size-fits-all method, but tailoring the approach to the individual. This requires deep psychological insight, extensive experience with different types of students, and most importantly, genuine care for the student's welfare rather than the teacher's ego gratification. The relationship itself becomes a kind of laboratory for transformation. Students project onto teachers their relationship with authority, their fears and hopes, their need for approval, or their rebellion against constraint. Skilled teachers recognize these dynamics and work with them rather than being manipulated by them. They maintain boundaries while offering genuine presence. They challenge without crushing. They support without enabling. They model rather than merely preach, demonstrating through their own being what transformed consciousness looks like. But Al-Ghazali was acutely aware of how this relationship can go wrong. Some teachers exploit students' vulnerability for power, money, or sexual access. Some become addicted to disciples' adulation, needing followers to feed their own egos. Some mistake preliminary attainments for full realization and lead students astray through their own confusion. Some are authentic but lacking in discrimination, accepting everyone without properly assessing whether students are prepared for advanced teachings. Similarly, students can corrupt the relationship. Some seek teachers who will confirm their existing views rather than challenging them toward growth. Some want magical shortcuts that bypass the hard work of transformation. Some are spiritual consumers, collecting teachings and experiences, but never committing deeply to any path. Some become cult-like followers, abdicating responsibility for their own development by blindly following without discrimination. The authentic teacher-student relationship avoids these pitfalls through clarity about its purpose and limits. The teacher's role isn't to give the student truth, as if truth were an object that could be transferred, but to remove obstacles preventing the student from discovering truth themselves. Think of it like learning to ride a bicycle. The teacher can explain principles, demonstrate techniques, even hold the bike initially to help you balance. But ultimately, you must find your own balance. The teacher can't do it for you. This means the relationship has a natural arc toward obsolescence. If it's working properly, the student gradually needs the teacher less as they develop their own capacity for discrimination and direct experience. The goal isn't permanent dependence, but maturity, the student becoming capable of continuing the journey independently and perhaps eventually serving as teacher for others. Al-Ghazali compared it to how children need parents intensely in infancy, but gradually develop autonomy through childhood and adolescence. Healthy parents facilitate this development rather than creating permanent dependence. He also emphasized that even advanced students need community, not just individual teachers. The community of fellow seekers provides support, challenge, and accountability in ways no individual relationship can. You see others struggling with similar difficulties and realize you're not uniquely flawed. You witness others' progress and feel inspired to continue despite your own setbacks. You serve others and discover that teaching deepens your own understanding. You're held accountable by people who know you well and won't let you rationalize away your own avoidance and resistance. The ideal context for spiritual development, according to Al-Ghazali, combines competent individual guidance with supportive community practice within a larger tradition that provides tested frameworks and methods. None of these alone is sufficient. Without individual guidance, you can practice for years without addressing your specific obstacles. Without community, you lack support and accountability. Without tradition, you're constantly reinventing the wheel, lacking access to accumulated wisdom about what works and what doesn't. This vision of spiritual development as requiring relationships, not just individual effort, challenges contemporary assumptions about self-help and autonomous individual development. You can't transform consciousness in isolation any more than you can learn a language without ever speaking to native speakers. The ego's resistance to transformation is too clever and too entrenched to be overcome purely through individual will. You need others to reflect your blind spots, support you through difficulty, and model possibilities you can't yet imagine. His legacy invites us not merely to study his ideas, but to undertake our own journey, to question deeply, to seek sincerely, to practice diligently, and to discover for ourselves the certainty that lies beyond all doubt. The path he illuminated remains open. The destination he reached remains attainable. The wisdom he embodied continues to call across centuries to all who have ears to hear and hearts ready to respond. The choice, as it has always been and always will be, remains ours to make.